Hello and welcome. So I'll break down this video into three essential parts. The first part we'll talk about preparing a silkscreen to get your image onto it. Then we'll go through exposing a silkscreen, and then finally using the print case to print our images, whether on paper or onto totes or shirts as well. In this first part, let me start off by talking about materials a little bit. Today I'm using a Speedball 110 monofilament silkscreen. This is 10 by 14 inches. I find this the perfect size when doing any kind of demonstration screen printing. These are easy to store and travel with, and they're perfectly inside the mobile print case. You can of course later on go larger if you want, but this is a perfect size to start out with. So again, this is Speedball brand 110 monofilament and 10 by 14 inches. You can find these at Michaels, online at Blick, and then of course through Amazon. Almost everything here can be found on Amazon, and I can forward links to you later on as well if you have more questions about supplies. So after the silkscreen, I'm going to want something to put my image onto my screen. In this case, I'm going to use a photo-based emulsion. This emulsion is light sensitive, so meaning that once it dries, it's sensitive to UV light, so sunlight. I use an exposure unit at home to expose my silk screens, but you don't have to use that. You can use bright sunlight outside. And in our second part of this video, we'll actually expose a screen just in outdoor light, which I'm assuming will probably be the best way for you to expose your screens there. This emulsion comes in two parts. I have a large container here, but you can buy it in smaller containers. So if you're just making a few screens here and there throughout the year, you may not want to buy a full-size container. You can buy a half size. But either or, the emulsion will come in two parts. It'll come in kind of A part and B part. This is the kind of activator which makes this light sensitive, and you'll want to fill this up with water, shake it around, let it sit for a few minutes so that the powder in here emulsifies with the water, and then you'll dump all this into this container and then stir it around really well and then let it sit. And what you'll find is that this emulsion will turn from a light blue kind of color into a darker green, a kind of medium, almost an army green in a way, a light army green, I guess I would say. Like you'll see in a couple minutes. And that's the color you know you're right as far as having the right mixture and combination. It is okay that if you dump all the water out in and there's still, you see a little bit more in the bottom, you can add a little bit more water into this, shake it around and try to get the rest out. You don't want to add too much more water, but just read the directions on here and it'll kind of let you know. I think it's wise to, of course, mix them, stir them up really well, and then let it sit for a couple hours. That way, if there's any bubbles in here, it lets the bubbles kind of rise to the top of this. In this process, when coating our screens, it's good to have at least one little rubber spatula around to help you with, and then a scoop coater. And these scoop coaters, again, you can find at Michaels. I believe at Michaels you'll find some in the kits with screens. You of course can get them at Blick and then online at Amazon as well. And these scoop coaters again just act as a trough of which we're going to put our emulsion into. And you can just see I'm just going to pour some out and just kind of fill the trough. Anything that's left over I don't use from this, I'm going to pour back into this container. It's still good. This is light sensitive. You typically want to do this process in kind of dimmer light if you can. It's okay as long as you're not working too slowly. And it's more important that it dries in complete darkness. That's really important because once it does dry, it's more sensitive to light. When coating it, I'm going to take my scoop coater and just drag it up one side of my screen. And I want to make sure I get a smooth coat. And honestly, this is probably the most difficult part in this entire process of this video is actually getting a good coating on your screen. This can be very challenging because, as you can see, I'm holding it at an angle and then dragging it up to coat my screen. If you can kind of see, I'll pull back here. And what I want to do is do that essentially once on both sides. I want to get one good coat. And I don't want my coat to be heavy. What I want it to do is fill in the silk screen from both sides. I don't necessarily want it to lay too heavy on top. I want it to kind of fill in those little holes that are in the screen itself. So we don't want any dripping, and we don't want it too loose or heavy. And again, I kind of stress that this can be one of the most difficult parts of this whole process, is actually getting a good even coat on your screen. And notice there's a few little light bubbles, and if I move slowly, I can kind of, right now what I'm doing is, instead of pouring against the frame, I'm just using that metal edge to kind of even out and drag up and pull any extra emulsion off the screen, so I get a nice, smooth, even coat. You don't have to worry about going all the way to the edges. This area is the area where you're going to put your image, so this is the most crucial area. All of this extra area that we don't hit, we can tape off later before we go to print, and we're not really critical. It's not a really critical area. It's okay that it's open. What is important is that we have a very nice, smooth coating on that. It's not heavy. You can kind of almost see through it. It looks pretty smooth. Even if there's some little areas that look like a little bubble or anything, you can just drag that edge over it to try to smooth it out. And once it's nice and smooth, you're ready. You can store this in the darkness. And so your case actually has rubber around the edges, so it's perfect to store a wet frame in. And so, like mine, I'll just open it up and then place my screen in here while it's wet. You also want to make sure that you lay it screen side up. So if you'll notice, I'll pull this back out again real quick, that this side, the screen side, is facing up. So we don't want that to touch another surface. It'll stick to it. So keep that side up. And then so I'm just going to slide it into my case and just let it rest. Close my case, make sure it's nice and closed. If you can, keep your case in a dark room or darker room that doesn't get a ton of light. And then let it dry overnight if you can. If you're pressed for time for any reason and you need it to dry quicker, you can put a little mobile fan in there, a battery-powered fan if you have one, and stick it inside there with the screen, and it'll dry in like 45 minutes or an hour, and it'll be ready to use. But typically, if you're working ahead and you know that the next day you're going to have your artwork ready and ready to expose your screen, just coat your screen the night before and let it dry overnight, and it's fine. As long as it's kept in the dark, it's absolutely fine. And there's no immediate need to use it, meaning that once you put your emulsion on it, and as long as it stays in the dark, you can keep it in the dark for a week, maybe even 2 weeks or 3 weeks. But if it is pulled out and gets exposed to, say, the fluorescence for about 5 minutes, it'll start to fog and expose that screen, and it'll ruin it. But again, as long as you do it maybe, say, the night before, just keep it in the dark, and then sometime the next day you're ready to expose it, you're perfect. You'll end up with a great image on your silk screen. When you're done and you have emulsion still left in your trough, you can just take that and just pour it straight back into your container, because it's still good. We can recycle and use this. It's not it's not bad. We can just put it back in there, and then we can use it for another screen later on when we want to do another image. So all these images that we put on our screens, we can strip off later on once we're done printing, and we can reuse that screen over and over again. We can put multiple images on it until essentially that screen tears or gets damaged or anything like that, which is more common than anything else. Or for some reason, ink gets left in it and dries up. But you do want to try to wash out this trough as soon as you can, or get it into water, because this emulsion, once it starts to dry, gets really hard and sticky, and is almost impossible to get off. It cakes on like stronger than like acrylic paint. So try to clean it off surfaces while it's wet, and then, you know, as long as you're done and have your screen put away, go ahead and just try to wash out your trough as soon as possible. So that's pretty straightforward as far as the process. Again, I think the trickiest part here is actually holding the trough at an angle and coating that screen. That can be one of the more difficult parts. So give yourself maybe a trial, a test one. At any rate, it's not, you still can get a good image even if you have some streaking or maybe even some heavy areas. We can talk about that a little bit more when we actually expose and wash out the screen of that image. Okay. Hi, so I'll go through exposing and getting your image on the screen in this video. So first you want to make sure that you have your artwork on a transparency. This particular transparency is good for holding and accepting water-based media. So it could be a paint pen, a paint Sharpie, anything that's going to create a really strong black image and black lines. This was printed through an inkjet printer to get nice crisp lines on it, but you can also draw on these as well. Just make sure that if you print this, or even if you're drawing, you want to make sure all the lines are super black and block light. And if you do print it, always double check. Sometimes these can get scratched, and we can just go through and paint on the back side and make sure that everything stays nice and black. There's a couple other things I want to have on hand. A black piece of paper. I've got about a 2-inch piece of foam here. This is just like upholstery foam that's been cut up. And then I have a heavy piece of glass to add weight. Now you don't have to find a heavy piece. Any piece of glass will do, but if you use just a regular like frame glass or something else, you want to make sure that you also weight it down on either side when you are exposing, because we want to make sure that we have really good connection to the image and the actual silkscreen itself. So I'm going to go ahead and put on top of here this black piece of paper, so that I'm kind of ready to pull my screen out of my case and get ready to expose. Now today, excuse me, we're going to expose outside. It is almost 2 o'clock. The UV outside from the sun, of course, is a little bit stronger at around noon. And then it starts to kind of diminish as the day goes on. I would say the best times to expose, especially if you're exposing outside, would be anywhere from 10 to 2 p.m. Anytime after that might take a little bit longer, especially if it becomes cloudy at all. So right now, again, it's about 2 o'clock, so I think we're going to expose our frame for about 45 seconds. So I will actually go ahead and set my timer first before I pull out my screen from the case. So I'm just going to set it at 45 seconds. And then I'm going to go ahead and pull my dry screen out of the case. And then I want to do this in low light before I go outside. I'm putting my screen on top of the black paper, which is on top of the foam. Then I'm just securing my image facing up so that I can read it on top of my screen, and then putting a piece of heavy glass on top, again, to get that good seal. And so now I'm going to walk this whole unit outside to start exposing. And so we're exposing now. We got about 35 seconds to go. So relatively quick. Do try to make sure that your glass is clean to make sure it doesn't affect the print at all. Anything else that is not on there that will cast a shadow or black can affect the final exposure of the screen. Most of which, if it's tiny, won't make a difference, and we can fix if we absolutely needed to. So about 10 seconds left here. Again, you know, if you're going to expose around 12:30, you could do it 30 seconds. We're closer to 2, so I'm doing about 45 seconds. And then again, as the day goes on, you want to kind of extend that time a little bit. Okay, so we're good. Let me take that off. And as soon as I take that off, I'm going to put some water on my screen. And I want to get it nice and wet. And you can start to see the image already on here. And so now water is going to help break up all the light areas where our image is. And so if we just rub it just a little bit, and really this first kind of 30 seconds, I really want the water just to do the work for me. And it's helping to kind of break up all those areas that were blocked by the sun. And you can see it starts to get a little bit lighter as we kind of move along here. Again, at about 30 seconds, I'll start to kind of wipe it a little bit. And again, hitting both sides. And I can already see that it's really starting to dissolve. And that's what I want to see. And most of the time, if your screen hasn't been hit by any other ambient light and has been kept in the dark, then water and just a sponge will almost completely dissolve any image on there. And so my final step is, now that I've kind of washed it out with just a sponge, is to hit it with a garden hose. And I'm just using a garden hose, just a regular garden hose, here on half vertical setting, but something semi-powerful. This will be a little bit loud. Just make sure you wash out both sides really well. And after you've kind of washed it and you can see through the screen, just double check. You can just hold it up to the light or up to the sky and make sure that you can see through the screen and that you've retained some tight, sharp lines and edges, and this all looks really good. This is perfect. This is exactly what we want. And now we just want to give it another quick little spray. And by doing that, I just get off the excess emulsion that may be on the external areas here. But once we've kind of rinsed it, now we can just let this dry. And once it's air dried, we're ready to print. Okay. Hi. Okay, so once we've exposed our screen and it is dry, we are ready to start printing. And of course, we're using our case as our base to print on, as well as a storage container to hold things like our ink, our squeegees, and everything else we need to print. In your print case, you'll find some hinges, some thumb screws, and then you should have some ink on hand. Whether you can of course find Speedball ink on Blick or Amazon or anywhere else, and any color you choose. Notice I use Speedball quite a bit, and you'll notice when you're purchasing Speedball that they now include, or have for a while, two different little icons. One has a shirt on it and one has just a set of papers. And so one ink is better for printing on fabric and the other better for just printing on paper. You can use them both. interchangeably, but the one that has a little bit of a t-shirt logo on it dries slower. So it may take anywhere from 15 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes to dry, whereas the print cans that are ink cans that have a paper logo on it will dry in a matter of 5 minutes. So it's really kind of up to you. You can also use the other ones with the paper logo just to print on fabric. Whether you use either one of them on fabric, you should iron your design after it's dried on the tote or shirt or whatever it may be on. And again, I can provide links exactly where to purchase this ink. But this is what you're going to be using, water-based silkscreen ink specifically for printing. And then you should have a squeegee and then an actual rubber spatula to kind of move paint, and then of course some paper. For this demonstration, I'm just going to be printing on 6x9 paper. I buy Richeson's, which is a good quality paper, and you can buy them 9x12 and 6x9 pieces. And then I've kept my design at 6x8 inches on the screen. And I find this is a really good size when you're printing out in the public. It's a manageable size. That way, if something goes wrong or gets too dirty, you can clean it up relatively quickly. The larger you go, the more difficult you'll find, especially in a public setting when printing. So printing smaller is definitely a lot easier as far as demonstrations. So when we're getting ready just to print, there's a couple things I want to do. One, you've seen that I've already put tape on 3 sides here. Your screen is going to have a gap between the emulsion and probably the outside edge of the frame. We want to make sure that we cover that. So I just use masking tape, and I'll make sure and go around all 4 sides and cover that gap. If we don't, then when we're printing, ink is going to get through those negative areas and onto our paper or onto our screen or anything else. And we want to, of course, prevent that. The next would be to go ahead and set up our hinges. So you have these spots all around your mobile print cart, and you can use any of them you want. It's set up so that you can have actually a station here, and if you're printing a larger screen, you could actually do a 20x24 screen on this top as well. Of course, there's room enough to store it inside, and put hinges here. So it really kind of depends on what you're doing and how much you want to have going on. You're just going to use these thumb screws to secure the hinges into their holes. And technically, you can probably get away with just using 1 per. You just want to make sure that they're not going to kind of shift around too much and that they're stable and kind of straight towards you. So just kind of secure these. Okay, so now I'm ready to put my screen in. Before I do that though, on the bottom corners, the bottom being either the bottom of the frame or the bottom towards where the bottom of the image, at the outside edges of these corners, I'm going to put 2 little pieces of just cut up cardboard. And what they do is help keep the frame just elevated ever so slightly, because the screen, we want to act a little bit kind of like a trampoline. We want it to kind of bounce back a little bit after we push ink through. So I put those 2 little tabs here and here. I'm going to flip my screen over now so that it's screen side towards the case. And then I'm going to put it up against my hinges. And I'm just going to tighten them up. And of course the hinge the reason why we use these hinges is so that I can easily lift the screen back and forth and then continually feed paper down to make sure that that I'm always kind of keeping the print aligned with the paper or shirts or totes or whatever I'm printing. That way I don't have to pull this off and then kind of guess. Now the next thing I'll do is I'll take a piece of paper. Before I add any ink or anything, I'm gonna put a piece of paper and I'm gonna line it up underneath where I think I want the print to land on the paper. And so right now I can see through my emulsion. I can see through the screen. So I can see that paper outlined here. And so now I'm just kind of shifting it until it's just about right. And I'm just kind of making it sure it's even on the paper. And it's right there. And so one thing I mentioned about the trampoline is that you want your screen to not be completely flat against the piece of paper. If it's fabric, it's okay. It's gonna be okay. But with paper, we definitely want it to bounce. If it doesn't bounce, then when we put that ink through, then it'll adhere itself to the piece of paper and then leave a texture when it kind of comes away. This way we get a nice even print when we're printing. And quickly to kind of mention, depending on, if you're printing on paper, you're gonna make probably 2 passes. If you're printing on fabric, you're gonna make more passes, pushing more ink through the frame because fabric wants to, of course, absorb more ink when you're printing. And by passes, I mean the amount of times you're running that squeegee across here and pushing ink through. But back to kind of lining up this paper print. Now that I can see through here, I see it's kind of aligned and I like where it's at. I'm gonna lift this up, leave the paper in that position, and then I'm gonna take a couple pieces of tape and I'm gonna make an L just in one little corner. And so each time and you can probably see that through the frame, I put an L of tape right here. So each time I can just put the corner of this paper in here. So when I go to put a new print or a new piece of paper unprinted, I'm just gonna put it right there, boom, go over top of it each time. So I'll take a picture of this real quick so that you can see in the video. So once I've done that, I'm ready to start printing. I've got my paper down. I know where I'm gonna put my paper each time. I'm now ready to put some ink on my frame. So I'm gonna open up my ink and take a little bit of a spatula here. I also, in my case, keep, of course, some rags, but also I find wet wipes really handy in wiping off ink off anything. Habitually, in printmaking, ink just travels. Like it'll get on you, it'll get on the frame, it'll just travel. So the more kind of rags or things you have around to be able to kind of combat that, the better. This ink is a little bit older, so that's why I opened up a new can. It's a little bit gummy. So I'm gonna put that aside. Newer ink should be kind of smooth and flowing like that, if you can kind of see. So what I'm gonna do is just kind of lay some of that up on the top of the screen, like so. And you don't wanna add too much, but you don't wanna add too little at the same time. You kind of want the right amount. Anything that's unused on the screen, and as long as it's not polluted or diluted with another color, can be put back into the container. So any ink I don't use on here, I'll just scrape back and put in there. But once I've got this kind of nice run of ink across the top, I'm now ready to kind of push it through my screen. I want a squeegee that is about the same width or slightly larger than my image area. So you can see I've got about maybe a half an inch on either side of this that's larger than the image, which is perfect. That's what I want. When I'm pulling just over the image area. You don't need to go from frame to frame, just from the top of your image to the bottom of your image. So that first print is going to be kind of crucial in getting your image through and print it onto the surface. So I made 2 passes right there. So let's go ahead and see. And perfect. Right there. So again, once I've got that, once I've made the first print and I've got that little mark, now I can take all my other paper, I take the guesswork out, I can just put it right in that little corner where I placed that, and I'm ready to start printing again. Make sure that each time you're trying to push that ink through evenly throughout the screen. One thing you can do is what's called as back flooding, and we kind of can lift the frame up and push ink across the frame, but not through. And we push it across like that, it gets even coverage. It's not sinking through yet, and then we come back and print it, push that ink through, and then hopefully we've got a good even print with all of our image on there. And then after that, it's just a matter of cranking them out. Obviously, you know, the nicest thing about having this kind of setup is that, one, you can store everything in and then travel with it. But when you set it up, it's great to have other people experience it, jump in, try doing some screen prints. You can, of course, do totes and shirts if you want. People love totes, I find, so even if you're printing, you know, depending on where you're printing and what you're doing, I always keep some extra totes on hand just to print, maybe sell them, depending on what the event is, and generally give them away for free. But you could set totes up and print on here too as well. Sometimes I'll take the screen off the hinges when doing totes and just kind of lay it on the hinge, lay it on the totes one by one. It really kind of depends. If it's a very thick tote, you definitely want to take it off the hinges. If they're thin, like the very thin kind of linen cotton ones, you can just leave the hinges, leave the screen on the hinges and just work on it. But again, once we've kind of got that corner mark there, I'm just going to put that in there. Going back, and I'm just, again, lightly back flooding. When I'm back flooding like that, I'm trying to skim the ink back across the surface, but not push it through. When it gets up to the top, now I'm adding pressure, and I'm at about a 45-degree angle here, and I'm coming across and adding that pressure down, and then I'm going to do a second one just to make sure.